religious discrimination is back in the news and it's quite a complex topic. Can you just take us back to where the conversation around this legislation first began?
Yeah, it's really, really complicated. And so first, I just want to set out the two main issues that we are addressing that will shape this entire conversation.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is the fact that there is not an explicit federal law banning religious discrimination in Australia.
There are laws that target sex discrimination, racial discrimination, but not one specifically about religious discrimination.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the first issue. The second is around the idea of religious exemptions. So should discrimination be allowed if it is due to religious reasons?
Can you give me an example of
Yeah,
that?
so an example is like, should religious schools be able to not employ a teacher on the basis of their sexuality?
So if it's a religious school that doesn't believe in same-sex marriage, for example,
Exactly.
then they can choose not to hire a teacher or discriminate against a teacher on that basis.
Yes, and that's a really big part of this conversation is should that legally be allowed?
Okay.
And you can't really talk about one of those issues without talking about the other.
Because it's a byproduct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
But to go back to your question of where this all started, we need to go back to 2017 when same-sex marriage was legalised in Australia. Now, long story short, after same-sex marriage was legalised, a review was promised to conservative religious groups who weren't happy about this legislation passing, and the review promised to look into whether Australian law adequately protects the right to freedom of religion in Australia.
Okay.
Now, honestly, I think if we go into exactly what that review said and what it recommended, we would be here all day. And I want to get into the more recent developments of this story. But I will just focus on how the coalition government responded to that review.
Okay. So we're talking about the coalition. I believe at that point it was led by Scott Morrison. Is that right?
Yeah, Scott Morrison had just got in.
Yeah. Okay. So how did the Morrison government respond to the review at the time?
So he promised a Religious Discrimination Act.
Okay.
And so he tried to pass this legislation actually a number of times. And it basically would have made it unlawful to discriminate against someone on the basis of their religious belief.
So that was focusing on the first point you spoke about, that there was no federal law that specifically was about discrimination on the basis of religion.
Yes, but where the controversy arose was on how it impacted that second point.
Yeah.
So it was really controversial at the time, basically because critics said that whilst the bill indeed would have protected religious people from discrimination, it also would have consequently led to more discrimination against LGBT plus people.
Okay.
So just to give you an idea, one MP who was actually from the same party as Morrison said that this legislation that he was trying to introduce would have left a transgender child open to legally being bullied, excluded, or even expelled because of their gender identity. Now, as you can imagine, the politics around the time were, like I said, really controversial, and ultimately it failed to pass despite multiple attempts.
I remember that time so clearly. I think it was the only time in my memory that a number of Liberal MPs crossed the floor. So they physically moved across the floor to sit with the opposition to vote against their own party because they said it was a bunch of moderate MPs, most of whom lost their seats actually. They said that they couldn't in good conscience vote for this bill. And it was extraordinary. It was so contentious. It was all over the news. But then it kind of just went away.
Yeah, well, it failed right before the 2022 election when Morrison was ousted as the Prime Minister. And so that left it to the Labor government to pick up this mess and lead the path forward on this really complicated debate.
Okay, so Anthony Albanese then had to deal with this piece of legislation that had failed before, but there was obviously an appetite from some for it to pass. What was Labor's position on the bill?
So Labor said that they supported protecting religious people from discrimination, but not if it came at the expense of other people's right not to be discriminated against. Now, when they got into government, they looked for advice. They said, we're not exactly the experts on this. We need advice on what to do now. And so they turned to the Australian Law Reform Commission to recommend a path forward. And if you don't know the Australian Law Reform Commission, they are an independent agency designed to do exactly that, to advise the government on law reform.
Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, I feel like we've gone down memory lane a bit. We've gone back to 2017. But my understanding is that brings us up to the present, to now. So last week, the Commission finally delivered its recommendations to the government. What were the recommendations? What did they say?
Yeah, it was hundreds of pages long. So obviously I'm not going to go through all of the recommendations, but a really significant one is the recommendation for the government to remove something called Section 38 in the Sex Discrimination Act.
Which is obviously not a religious discrimination act. So we're talking about existing legislation that's already about discrimination, and there's an exemption there?
Yeah, there's an exemption, and it's really important to understand this. So currently in the Sex Discrimination Act, there is an exemption which allows religious schools to discriminate against someone based on their sex, their sexual orientation, gender identity, or their marital or relationship status.
And what would that mean, scrapping it?
So scrapping it entirely would mean that religious schools cannot dismiss staff or expel students based on, if they're gay or if they're transgender or other similar factors. And so this report said that getting rid of that exemption would substantially narrow instances where religious schools can discriminate against people.
Okay, so there we're talking about, sorry to keep going back to the first two groups you set out, but that's the second group. But what about the first group? We spoke about the fact that there was a discussion around protecting the right of religion too.
And so in that regard, it recommended keeping the right of religious schools to preference hiring someone of the same religion over a candidate who does not follow the school's faith.
Okay.
So that would allow religious schools to require adherence to their faith as part of their vetting process for jobs, as part of a school's broader effort to build a community of faith. So basically they just recommended keeping that and really protecting that. And how they recommended protecting that is by introducing an exemption in the Fair Work Act, which sets out workplace laws in Australia.
Okay, and so that was all advice that was given to the government in the form of a report of many pages. How did the government respond to this advice?
Basically, they've just said that they are considering these recommendations and that they'll look at it before they give a more concrete way forward. But what was a really interesting development in the government's response to this was that Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said that he will not pass a law on religious discrimination unless the opposition supports it. And so that is a big development. And what he's saying is that this has been such a divisive debate in Australia over the last literally 7 years. I mean, since same-sex marriage was legalised. And he's saying, we do not want this to be divisive anymore. We are going to do this with the opposition and move forward.
But I mean, that's fascinating because the opposition or the coalition themselves couldn't agree as a party. They had their own members crossing the floor. Labor would be the same in terms of, lots of different views and emotions and all the rest. I can hardly see bipartisanship happening in this sort of context.
Clearly, Albanese possibly thinks that that could happen.
Have we had any indication from the opposition?
Yeah, well, TDA journalist Harry Sekulich spoke to the opposition. He spoke to the Shadow Attorney General, Michaelia Cash, who told him that the coalition notes that representatives of Christian schools, the Catholic Church, Islamic schools, and a number of other faith groups have expressed serious concerns with this report and its recommendations. And she also added that she encourages the Albanese government to address these concerns. Now, when Harry pressed her on what exactly those concerns were, she did not clarify.
Okay, interesting. So still a bit to work through there. What about the community more broadly? This is legislation that would affect many, many people. What have we heard from the community?
Yeah, so Michaelia Cash, she just mentioned Christian schools as one example of a group of schools that weren't happy. And she's right. Christian Schools Australia said the recommendations amount to, quote, a direct attack on faith and freedom of belief in Australia. And they also said that Christian education would cease to exist under the proposed changes. But then on the other hand, there's Equality Australia, which is the peak LGBT plus body in Australia. And they welcomed the report and they urged the government to make the recommendations law. The CEO of Equality Australia, Anna Brown, said, quote, Every day we delay these reforms, there will be more students who are robbed of their chance to become a school prefect or take their partner to the formal, and there will be more teachers who are fired or told they're no longer fit for any promotions. So there she's addressing the recommendation to completely get rid of that exemption I talked about of Section 38.
It'll be really interesting to see what happens from here. I mean, it tore the last government apart, and it seems like there are still many unresolved issues that need attention. So a lot of work cut out for the government, and especially if they're seeking bipartisan support there. Thanks so much for joining us on the Daily Aus. If you enjoyed today's episode, you can follow us on Spotify or Apple. Sends a signal to the platforms that you love what we do, and it means that you'll have an episode waiting for you every weekday morning.
Or if you're listening on YouTube, you can subscribe and you can see that Zara and I are actually wearing the same shirt today.
We have morphed into the same person. 3 years in the making. Thanks for joining us.